The Grand Hall in Washington was packed, 2,000 economists, investors, policymakers, and journalists from across the world. Cameras zoomed in, fingers hovered over keyboards, and the tension was electric. Everyone waited for the IMF president's verdict. Then came the words. Burkina Faso is a complete economic disaster. Christina Jorga, the most powerful woman in global finance, delivered the line with a sharp, dismissive tone. The room burst into muffled laughter. Delegates exchanged smirks. Heads shook in disbelief. Fingers flew across keyboards, blasting headlines onto Bloomberg terminals and news tickers. Red Circle hashtag Burkina collapse trends worldwide. Red Circle IMF declares Burkina Faso a disaster. Red Circle Africa's youngest leader faces global embarrassment. CNN cut in with breaking news. BBC analysts nodded in agreement. Financial Times published a scathing editorial within minutes. Burkina Faso's leadership, a crisis of youth and incompetence. Traoré stood there. Just 34 years old, the youngest head of state in the room. Alone. Silent. Every camera lens trained on him, waiting for a reaction. Investors whispered, "Pull the plug." Bankers drafted exit memos. Twitter erupted in memes mocking the boy president. Across the globe, people watching live began typing in chat. Too young to lead. What did you expect from a military coup? Africa's same old story. And yet, they didn't see it. They didn't see the calm in his eyes. The subtle smile playing on his lips. The file in his hands, thick, heavy, and filled with numbers that could rewrite the story. What they didn't know was that Traoré wasn't holding a defense. He was holding a weapon, a data-driven bomb about to detonate at the heart of the world's most powerful institutions. Before we dive into the shocking reversal that unfolded next, hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the global narrative. Because this isn't just a tale about Burkina Faso. It's about standing up, rewriting the rules, and daring to be heard. Let's get into it. The air inside the Grand Hall of the IMF World Bank Summit was thick with anticipation, a silent pressure that weighed down like an invisible fog. Cameras zoomed in, journalists clutched their notepads, and Christina Jorga sat poised, her confidence radiating under the stage lights. Ibrahim Traoré, the 34-year-old leader of a nation dismissed as a disaster, stood alone at the podium, his eyes sweeping the crowd, a quiet defiance etched into his face. A hush fell as he spoke his first words, not a defense, not an apology, but a simple, piercing question that cut through the room like a blade. Madam President, when was the last time you updated your data on Burkina Faso? The words hit like a gunshot in a cathedral. The room froze, 2,000 pairs of eyes darted toward Jorga, whose smug confidence cracked, her fingers tightening on the armrest. Her advisors leaned in, whispering frantically, but she stayed silent, because there was no answer. Traoré didn't pause. He opened the thick file in his hands, pages heavy with facts, charts, and numbers, and the hall seemed to hold its breath. His voice was calm, controlled, each word a bullet aimed straight at the heart of the global narrative. GDP growth in 2023, 8.5%. A ripple ran through the crowd. Heads turned. Phones lit up. The IMF had predicted a 3% contraction. The projection was wrong. The audience wasn't prepared. Neither was the global press. Unemployment, down from 45% to 18%. A gasp. The financial elite, those who had labeled him too young, too inexperienced, now sat silent, blinking in disbelief. Inflation, down from 15% to 3.2%. The silence shattered, whispers burst into urgent phone calls, reporters' fingers flying across keyboards, updates flooding news wires. Gold production doubled. And 80% of the revenue now stays in Burkina Faso. Not in the hands of foreign companies. A collective murmur rolled through the room, shock, admiration, even envy. This wasn't just a speech, it was a reckoning. Our food self-sufficiency, up from 40% to 75%. 500 schools built. 3 million citizens now have access to free healthcare. Child mortality down by 40%. Terrorist attacks reduced by 60%. 1 million displaced citizens have returned home. Each number was a strike, each fact, a fist breaking the silence of decades. The audience's eyes flicked to Christina Jorga, who sat frozen, the color draining from her face. Her earlier laughter now felt like a distant, haunting echo. The same media that had once labeled Traoré a failure was now scrambling. CNN's breaking news ticker flipped to Burkina Faso's economic miracle. The Financial Times rewrote its headlines. Twitter exploded, #leader who silenced IMF trending worldwide. Traoré's voice rang clear, unshaken, "You told the world we were a disaster. Now, I ask, whose data was wrong?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air, the weight of it pressing down on every person in the room. The cameras caught every angle, the IMF president's clenched jaw, the diplomats leaning forward, the journalists wide-eyed with disbelief. In that moment, Traoré wasn't just a young president from a small African nation, he was the man who had turned the tables on the most powerful economic institution on earth. And he had done it not with anger, but with numbers, an unstoppable force of truth in a world built on assumptions. The applause, when it came, was not a ripple, it was a tidal wave. A standing ovation erupted across the hall, thunderous and prolonged. Traoré stood quietly, hands resting on the podium, as if he had expected this all along. And in homes across Africa, in cafes in Ouagadougou, in classrooms, in dusty villages, the people of Burkina Faso watched live. They stood up. They cheered. They danced in the streets. Because at that moment, they weren't just watching a speech, they were witnessing the birth of a new era. The hall, moments ago filled with the smug confidence of a Western-dominated audience, now trembled under the weight of truth. Cameras, once aimed at Ibrahim Traoré like a hunter's sightline on prey, began to twitch, reframing, adjusting focus. Reporters' hands hovered over keyboards, tweets half-written, as if the entire media machine had been caught mid-breath. Traoré's fingers gripped the edges of his file. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words, his numbers, were louder than any microphone could amplify. Unemployment, he began, his eyes sweeping the room, stopping deliberately at the IMF delegation. Down from 45% to 18%. A ripple coursed through the audience, papers rustled, murmurs swelled. Journalists darted glances at each other. From the back, a gasp, audible, raw. Traoré didn't wait. The air was thick, but he cut through it with precision. Inflation, he continued, flipping the page with a soft but deliberate snap. Dropped from 15% to 3.2%. A flash, literally. A photographer's camera exploded in light, capturing the IMF president's face twisted in disbelief. Her advisors huddled, whispering like cornered animals. Jorga's hands fumbled at her earpiece, but no lifeline came through. And then, the data strikes hit harder, sharper. Gold production. 2022, 35 tons. 2023, 70 tons. Doubled. The hall stirred like a restless ocean, surging toward a storm. Revenue retention. Traoré's smile was razor-sharp, daring anyone to challenge him. 80% now stays in Burkina Faso. Not siphoned to offshore accounts. Not swallowed by foreign firms. He paused, letting the weight of that figure settle, watching the silent panic flicker across the faces of Western financiers. Food self-sufficiency, Traoré resumed, flipping the next page, this time, a full-color chart, projections slashing across the screen behind him. 40% to 75%. We fed our people. We stopped waiting for food aid that never came. Jorga's face drained of color, her fingers trembling, her pen motionless. The World Bank president shifted uncomfortably, his tie suddenly too tight. Traoré's next words were slower, sharper, each syllable like a blade unsheathed. 500 new schools, built in a single year. The audience shifted again. Delegates from Africa stared in disbelief, some sat forward, eyes wide, as if drawn in by gravity itself. 3 million citizens receiving free healthcare. A burst of whispers now, 3 million? The number seemed impossible, yet the documents were there, page after page, stamped and signed. Child mortality rate, Traoré's voice softened slightly, a flash of pain in his eyes, reduced by 40%. A shiver ran through the room. This wasn't just economics. It was survival. And then he lifted the final pages, the weight of them a symbol of resistance, of truth weaponized. Terror attacks, down 60%. Now, there were audible gasps. Refugees returning home, 1 million. Silence. A stunned, breathless silence. Delegates from the US, France, and Britain stared, mouths slightly agape. The cameras zoomed in on their faces, the disbelief, the discomfort, the dawning horror. CNN broke in with a banner, breaking, Burkina Faso's shocking data shakes IMF. BBC followed, Traoré's triumph, African leader silences IMF. Al Jazeera ran a live ticker, #leader who silenced IMF trends worldwide. Journalists scrambled for their laptops, some openly shaking their heads, muttering, "How did we miss this?" Phones buzzed across the hall. Messages poured in. Global market tickers flashed warnings, Africa rising. And in the eye of this storm, Traoré stood unmoved, his eyes steady, his voice calm, his presence magnetic. He wasn't just reading numbers. He was rewriting the narrative. "This is not a miracle," he said, voice firm. "This is what happens when a nation stands for itself, when data becomes a weapon of truth, and when a people refuse to be defined by others' projections." The hall erupted, not just in applause, but in a visceral, almost primal response. Delegates clapped, shouted, some standing on their feet. The cameras panned across the IMF table, frozen, color-drained, their fortress of authority crumbling in real time. Christina Jorga, the so-called queen of finance, sat stunned, a pen dangling uselessly in her hand. Her advisors whispered furiously, but no spin could cover this disaster. Burkina Faso had spoken, and the world had listened. The room held its breath, a collective anticipation vibrating in the air. Traoré's voice, calm yet cutting, sliced through the tension. "For too long," he began, his eyes sweeping across the sea of diplomats, "you've labeled Africa as a problem. Not because we are. But because you never cared to know us. You never updated your data. You never listened. That ends today." The words landed like thunder, not just as a challenge but as a verdict. A quiet ripple turned into a storm, reporters typing furiously, whispers erupting into shouts, live broadcasts stammering to catch up. The IMF's panel looked shell-shocked. Christina Jorga, once the unshakable force of global finance, sat frozen, her hands trembling as advisors leaned in, whispering in panic. The old system had been blindsided, by a leader they underestimated, by a nation they wrote off. And beyond the walls of the IMF, a different scene was unfolding. On the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, the news hit like a lightning bolt. Markets that had stood still burst into motion. Vendors dusted off their stalls, children streamed out with flags drawn in crayon, women in marketplaces ululated with tears streaming down their faces. Drums rolled through the neighborhoods, not in protest, but in victory. Farmers lifted their shovels to the sky in a gesture of defiance. This was their land, their future. In front of screens across Africa, families gathered, transfixed by the broadcast, some whispering prayers, others shouting with joy. Social media blazed with hashtags, #WeAreNotYourDisaster and #TraoreVictory. Videos of jubilant crowds flooded feeds, while comment sections swelled with words like legend, the hope of Africa, and the beginning of a new era. In offices from Washington to Paris, officials scrambled to draft statements, yet every word felt hollow. The global financial order, so long used to dictating terms, had just been humbled, not by military might, but by raw, undeniable truth. And standing tall in the center of it all was Traoré. Not just as a president, but as a symbol, a mirror held up to the world, forcing it to confront its own arrogance, its blind spots, its history of exploitation. His voice echoed not just in the hall, but across continents. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was a message to every nation that had ever been dismissed, every people who had ever been told they were too small, too weak, too late. The old game was over. The narrative had shifted. As Traoré left the stage, a new image was seared into history, not of a humiliated young leader, but of a man who had faced down an empire with nothing but truth, and won. The applause that erupted in the hall was not just for the numbers, not just for the speech, it was for the man who had just redefined what it meant to lead. As the final echoes of clapping faded, the realization hung heavy in the air. Ibrahim Traoré had not simply defended Burkina Faso, he had shifted the narrative of an entire continent. Cameras stayed locked on him, capturing the moment the old guard crumbled. The IMF president, once a figure of unchallenged authority, now stood silent, her notes crumpled in her hands, her gaze averted. Diplomats exchanged glances, the weight of what they had just witnessed settling in like a storm front. The words, Burkina Faso, from disaster to model of resilience, scrolled across breaking news banners worldwide, an admission that even the most powerful could no longer ignore the truth. But outside those walls, in the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, the real story was unfolding. From the market stalls to the schoolyards, from village squares to the capital's main boulevard, the people of Burkina Faso had erupted in joy. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a reclaiming of dignity, a collective breath of relief after years of suffocation. Children ran barefoot, their laughter slicing through the hot afternoon air. Vendors reopened their stalls, setting out baskets of mangoes, tomatoes, and yams, their hands trembling with a sense of renewed purpose. Elderly women, tears streaming down their weathered faces, sang ancient songs of freedom. Men banged on empty barrels and homemade drums, their rhythms rising like a heartbeat synced to the land itself. In rural villages, farmers hoisted Traoré's image high above their heads, printed on makeshift banners, painted on walls, carved into wood. It was as if the entire nation had rediscovered itself, each drumbeat a declaration, we are here. We are not what they said. And beyond Burkina Faso, a ripple turned into a tidal wave. In Ghana, young activists rallied outside foreign embassies, demanding fair trade policies. In Nigeria, students flooded social media with hashtags like #AfricaRises and #TraoreEffect, urging leaders to prioritize data-driven policies over foreign dictates. In Kenya, Crowds gathered in city centers, watching replays of the speech on giant screens, chanting in unison, "We are not your disaster." Even in the corridors of power, the tremors were undeniable. Analysts on Wall Street scrambled to adjust risk models. Investment banks issued rushed statements about reassessing African market potentials. Think tanks published late-night op-eds grappling with the question, if Burkina Faso could do this, what else have we been missing? The World Bank quietly suspended its next forecast for the continent, promising a full review of its data processes. The IMF's own Africa division scheduled an emergency summit to rebuild trust and engage in a spirit of partnership. But the damage was done. The old narrative of African incompetence, of perpetual failure, had been shattered by one leader, one speech, one moment. And as the sun set over Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré didn't just stand as a political figure, he stood as a symbol. A mirror, reflecting the arrogance of a system that had written off nations without listening. A torch, lighting the path for a generation that refused to be silenced. And a promise, whispered on the winds across the Sahel, we will not be dictated to. We will lead our own future. The next morning, global newspapers featured images of Burkina Faso streets, women dancing with their babies strapped to their backs, men waving flags made from bedsheets, children drawing pictures of Traoré in the dirt. Headlines ranged from "A New Era for Africa" to "The Day the IMF Got Schooled." And as the world debated, as panel discussions unfolded on primetime television, as social media buzzed with clips of Traoré's quiet, cutting words, inside Burkina Faso, the people simply went back to work. Farmers returned to their fields, teachers to their classrooms, builders to their sites. The message was clear, this wasn't the end of a speech. It was the beginning of a movement. Traoré himself walked calmly through the presidential gates that evening, greeted not by cheers of politicians, but by the quiet nods of workers and the smiles of schoolchildren who knew, deep down, that they were no longer just part of a country branded as a disaster. They were part of a story that had been rewritten, a story that now belonged to them. And as night fell, the fires of celebration continued to burn, not in defiance, but in hope. A continent had been reminded of its worth. A system had been exposed. And a young leader, once dismissed as too inexperienced, had shown the world the power of standing firm, of speaking truth with data, and of fighting for the dignity of one's people. Africa was no longer asking for permission. It was claiming its seat at the table. If you believe in rewriting the narrative, in the power of truth to shake the world, hit that like button. Subscribe, so you never miss the stories they don't want you to hear. And tell us in the comments, where should this story go next? Let's write the next chapter, together.